This is Duke University.
Okay, well, I want to welcome everybody here. I'm Linwood Pendleton. I'm the Director of Ocean and Coastal Policy at the Nicholas Institute, and I'm an adjunct professor at the Duke Marine Lab. Before I get started, I have a long list of people I want to thank. This turns out to be quite an undertaking, definitely non-trivial. And so many of you have heard from Annie Brock and Jesse Ritter directly. They really helped put this together. And they did that through the Ocean Policy Working Group, which is a student-run group that has been focusing on ocean policy issues. And this is our first attempt to work together. Obviously, the Nicholas Institute played a large role in this effort, but so did the Nicholas School of the Environment and the Duke University Marine Lab, both in terms of funding, but just in terms of people that made this happen, like Susan Gerbeth-Jones here, and Jeff Priddy and Tom Wahlberg down in the Beaufort campus. So thank you guys very much. Also, thanks to Dominic Brugnolati. Help me. Brugnolati. For making this work and getting us the repass room. Let me tell you a little bit about this panel because it's different than anything we've done before. About a year ago to the day, one of our panelists, Ray Hilborn, who's participating with us remotely, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about feeling okay to eat fish. And the op-ed talked about the fact that there are important differences between having a fish stock that's overfished and a fish stock that we're overfishing. And he went into some more detail. But the thing I think that was most notable from our perspective about that op-ed was what a wide variety of reactions that generated, from people kind of shaking their head and saying, yeah, I get what Ray's talking about here, to people saying, I don't get what Ray's talking about at all. You know, and over the course of the year, NOAA also came out with a position that was written up in the Washington Post by another panelist of ours, Juliet Eilperin, that said, you know, at NOAA we believe that now we've really turned the corner in fisheries, and that we think that we're no longer overfishing most federal fish stocks. And as we discussed this here, we realized that whether or not you think we've turned the corner in fisheries has as much to do with personal factors as it does to do with the science. And it has to do with your experiences and what you think is the baseline that we're recovering to, and the trade-offs that you think we should make between eating fish and catching fish and leaving fish in the sea. So what we've done with this panel is brought together a group of people that we believe have diverse perspectives and experiences, not to talk about the science of stock assessment so much, but really how their personal perspectives, their experiences, what they believe is the baseline that is the reference for determining how well the fishery is doing, has influenced the degree to which they think our fisheries turning the corner. And I think some of our other panelists are going to even ask if that's the right question at all, or whether we should rephrase that question. Does it make sense to talk about whether fisheries are turning the corner? We're not looking for one universal answer here, but we're really looking for an exploration of the path that these people have taken to get there. And we've done this with an audience that is composed largely of Duke University students here in Durham and at the Marine Lab there. So this is an opportunity for us to let our students ask questions of the experts in a way that doesn't normally happen. So we really want you to be thinking about this and think about asking about these personal, political, social perspectives of what these many varied experts do. We're not going to talk about the specifics of the science or what do the data say specifically, but we could talk about why did you interpret the data that way. Okay, so really think about that. In addition to these two groups we have here in Durham and in Beaufort, this is being streamed too. And people who are watching this on streaming, if you want to send us a question, you can send us a question at jessica.ritter, R-I-T-T-E-R, @duke.edu. And we'll try to take some questions from you. We'll have people tweeting. And if you're following on Twitter, We're going to use the hashtag Overfishing panel, so look for that. And what we're going to do is we're going to start 5 minutes, no PowerPoints. We'll have each of our panelists say whatever they want to say about the kinds of things I've just described, including introduce themselves, and they can tell you whatever they think is important that you need to know about who they are. And then we'll open this up to you. Okay? So remember, this is not a debate as much as this is an exploration. It's a real opportunity, especially for our Duke students, to talk about things beyond the science, beyond the natural science. Okay? So with that, let's get started with Ray Hilborn, who is with us remotely in Seattle.
Okay, so I start my clock here?
Please do.
Yeah, thanks very much for the opportunity, and particularly thanks for putting up with my not getting on an airplane. I'm sure the greenhouse gas balance is the better for using the video. So I'm a professor at University of Washington, School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences. I've been here since 1987. Prior to that, I worked, when I came out of graduate school, I worked for the Canadian Department of Fisheries and Oceans and Environment. And later in my career, before I came here, I worked for the South Pacific Commission on Tuna in the South Pacific. And my experience, I'm a terrestrial ecologist by training, but I've worked mostly on fisheries for the last 40 years or 30 years, whatever it amounts to these days. I guess it is 40 years. And my experience has been mostly in the Pacific Ocean, Western Canada, Western United States, Australia, New Zealand, Western Pacific countries. So in through the 2000s, I got increasingly interested in what characterized fisheries as doing well or not doing well. A lot of the fisheries I worked in were what one would just consider quite successful fisheries. Some of them, the classic examples of successful fisheries. And then this was highlighted when the paper Boris was lead author on in 2006 came out. Boris and I did a bunch of work together in NC's working group. You probably all know something about that. So here's what I think are the interesting issues. And it really is, what is the target, what is the baseline? And so in our early discussions, Boris and I tried to understand why we had such different perspectives. And one of my hypotheses was that it was because I was coming from a fisheries agency perspective where the objective of fisheries was to produce food. You did that by depleting stocks well below the level they would be in the absence of fishing. Whereas to a marine ecologist, any disturbance of the pristine system is in some sense negative. And that's a big deal. You know, what is it we're actually trying to achieve in the oceans? And if we're trying to produce food, we have to admit that the oceans are going to be different. They're not going to be the same. Another issue I've gotten increasingly interested in this debate of what we're trying to achieve is sort of the distinction about what is sustainable as opposed to what doesn't have environmental impacts. So I would argue that a very high proportion of fisheries are sustainable in the Brundtland sense. That is, those resources will be there in 100 years for our grandchildren to use, but they will have environmental effects. In fact, producing food has environmental effects. There's no way to get around it. And what I find so intriguing is that we are somehow setting the bar for fisheries much, much higher than we are for other forms of food production. So if you take the gold standard of marine certification, the Marine Stewardship Council, it says that you will not transform the structure and function of the ecosystem. And something like 20% of the world's fish production has now been certified at that standard. And yet no form of industrial agriculture could possibly meet that standard, because in industrial agriculture, we rip out native ecosystems and replace them with exotic species. And so, again, it's, I don't have strong opinions on where we should be, but I think this is an interesting choice, and it leads to some right now, forage fish is a hot issue. The Pew Institute for Ocean Science just came out with a report. Well, I'll guarantee you can't take food from the ocean and not have less food for other things in the ocean. That's a fact of life. If we want to produce food from the ocean, we are going to have fewer birds and mammals feeding on them, okay? But that's also true on the land, that you can't plow the prairies and have the same number of buffalo you used to have. There's no form of food production that doesn't reduce the environment. So I will pose an interesting question. It's, what's the environmental cost of marine conservation? So the U.S. right now has a very conservative harvesting policy, and it leads to higher abundances than you would have with, say, maximizing maximum sustainable yield. But if we produce less food from the ocean by being cautious, or as the Australians are doing, by locking up the coral sea, that food's going to come from somewhere. And what I would argue from my work so far is that the cost of that may be higher. The conservation benefits of cautious or very cautious fishing will effectively be negative because we'll end up producing food some other way, whether it comes from China or whether it comes from farming, that will come at a higher cost. And I haven't seen any signals, but I only have 4 seconds left, so I'll stop.
That's right. Good place to wrap up. Thank you, Ray. So that's a great example that went by fast. Okay.
Oh, wait. I'm just going to put up a little promo, my book that just came out. Where is it? Overfishing, what everyone needs to know. Sorry.
Okay. Then Juliet gets to put up her. Okay. So let's go now with Marty Smith from Duke University.
Great. Thanks for having me here. I'm Marty Smith. I'm an economist here at Duke in both the Nicholas School of the Economics Department. I work. Oh, no. Oh, yes. So let me give you a few mic instructions. So make sure this is on. We'll pass it down. When it's time for you guys to speak, you'll have to turn the microphone on.
Also tell Beaufort that anyone who's sitting on the right side of the room we can't see.
So make sure you
So you should all move to the left side of the room.
Now you're really faint. Try, Marty.
He said, "Move. We can't see you."
They heard it. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Go ahead, Marty.
Start over.
Yes, let's start over.
Okay. I'm Marty Smith. I'm an economist at Duke, and I'm both in the Nicholas School of the Environment and Department of Economics. Quickly, I mostly work on the economics of fisheries, and I'm doing a fair amount of work on economics of climate adaptation in the coastal zone. I'm also the editor of the journal Marine Resource Economics, which I took over on Sunday. So send your papers there. So are we turning the corner on fisheries? My take on this is it's the wrong question. I guess that's a little bit of what Ray was saying, but I'll say it a little bit differently. A better question is, are we maximizing the total economic value that we can get from the oceans? And before anyone jumps at this crazy thing that an economist just said, what I mean by total economic value would include commercial extraction of seafood, recreational fishing, aquaculture facilities, siting aquaculture facilities in the oceans, various forms of non-use values, which could include things like whale watching, contributions of the oceans to climate regulation, or more abstract things like the intrinsic value of biodiversity. Other sorts of use values that we don't associate with fishing, shipping, oil and natural gas extraction, and increasingly interest in offshore wind and tidal energy. So my question, I would prefer to answer questions like that and put fisheries into that broader context. Now, if we narrowly define the question, are we turning the corner on overfishing from a single species perspective, and let's just say in the U.S., yeah, I think basically we're doing a good job. We are rebuilding overfished fish stocks, and we're increasingly preventing overfishing here. But from a narrow perspective of just fisheries, and let's even limit it to the U.S. still, are we getting the most economic value out of fisheries? I'd say we have some successes and some places where that's not necessarily true. The successes would include particularly some of the catch share programs where we're actually catching fish sustainably but generating economic profit or economic rent. Things like the Pacific halibut, which are kind of the poster child. Arguably, we're doing a good job with Alaskan pollock. We have some species in the mid-Atlantic where we have catch shares, surf clams, tilefish, and so forth. And it's still an open question as to whether the New England groundfish sectors is turning the corner in that sense. But for many, if not most, U.S. fisheries, especially state fisheries, we're still managing with wasteful forms of regulation like input controls. We still are perpetuating regulated open access and so forth. And we have massive overcapitalization, and increasingly we're seeing resistance to rationalization programs that would solve economic problems of fisheries. Now, broadening out, how am I doing on time? 2 minutes left. From a single species perspective, I think everyone in this room knows that overfishing is kind of a fiction. Ecosystems don't exactly work like that, but we're not really systematically in policy engaging these trade-offs across ecosystems. We're not pricing by catch. So we have weird things like the race to bycatch. We're setting maximum sustainable yields, and then we're talking about, but not really doing, adjustments for ecosystems or adjustments for optimum yield. Now, the scientific community is also, I think, failing to understand the market context. Ray alluded to this a little bit, but I want to talk more about it. There's this report at Lenfest talking about forage fish, which has no recognition whatsoever of the market context of what those four fish are doing in the fish meal and fish oil markets, and how those contribute to value. Moreover, we don't really even have an infrastructure set up for addressing mixed uses that I alluded to before. So here are some realities of seafood markets that jumped out at me when I read Ray's op-ed that I think we need to think about in this context. One, most seafood for human consumption is now coming from aquaculture, not from fisheries. Two, most seafood in the U.S., EU, and Japan is imported. And three, most imports are from developing countries with really limited regulatory infrastructure and weak institutions. But that is also supporting important foreign exchange and livelihoods. So if we think about what Americans are actually eating and reflecting on, are we turning some corner on fisheries, the waters get much muddier. We have things like shrimp. Half of that's wild and half farmed globally. Salmon, also roughly in the half farmed, half wild. Tuna, there's some good news there, but we also have complicated international institutions trying to get a handle on managing tuna. Pollock, again, I mentioned there's some possible successes there. Tilapia, that's all farmed, mostly from Asia. We don't know a whole lot about environmental impacts. I'm out of time. So turning the corner means starting to think about these broader issues and contextualizing fisheries in seafood and food systems more broadly.
Terrific. Ray, can you make sure you're on mute when you're not talking? And
Yeah, I was. Yeah.
Okay, and panelists, hold the microphone a little bit closer.
Hi there. I'm Juliet Eilperin. I'm the national environmental reporter for the Washington Post, and I'm the author of Demon Fish, Travels Through the Hidden World of Sharks. I do not have a copy to flash, but you can go to demonfishbook.com and find it and buy it. And I come from my own perspective, which is both a Washington-centric perspective on a certain level, although I've traveled the globe looking at fisheries, and also a reporter's perspective. And so I think, by the way, in terms of an overarching view of this, I'm very much, I would say, in Marty's camp in terms of I think you really have to look at all these different factors in a comprehensive way. While I think, again, food production is definitely part of it, there are all these other things to take into account. And one of the things I love covering about the environment is there's really, for my entire career, I have essentially covered, whether I was covering Congress or now the environment, how people in positions of power make decisions that affect people's lives. And now I could add to that animals and ecosystems' lives. And so that's really what I look at. And I actually have a guiding principle, which I inherited from a discussion with an ex-boyfriend, which is something that always makes my husband uncomfortable. But it's when he turned to me and said, life is full of choices. And that's really what I feel that my job is to provide as honest an accounting as possible of what those choices are, which, again, I think someone like Ray is very invested in and I think is very important. And in this context, I will talk both about fisheries, but specifically about sharks, since that's something I focused on a lot. And what I find fascinating in looking at, again, fisheries broadly and specifically what's going on with sharks is the fact that people are often not very honest about the choices involved, and also just how the system is rigged in various ways. And I go back to one of the first conversations I had when I started this beat and wanted to cover fisheries, and I went in to have a conversation with Congressman Barney Frank, someone you might be familiar with, and who's retiring this year, legendary Massachusetts Democrat. And I was looking at a story having to do with fishing policy in New England, which is a notoriously contentious situation. I would say that, one thing that's funny is the thing that maybe provides me with the most headaches when I cover it is climate change in terms of the polarization, and fishing would be number two. And so I went in, and I sat down, and we were sitting in his office, and he's not known for being kind of the neatest person. He, in fact, his first campaign for Congress, literally it had a picture of him with the slogan, "Neatness isn't everything." And he's also not known for, again, being an outdoorsman. I'll put it at that. And I said, look, I want to talk to you about, kind of fishing policy and controversy over what's happening in Gloucester and, areas around there. And he looked at me, and I wish I still had my notes, but literally he said something to the effect of, I couldn't care less about fish. I care about people. I care about my constituents. I don't like nature. I don't go outdoors. That's not my issue. And while, again, I appreciated his blunt talk, which is what Barney Frank is legendary for, I think it was interesting, both in that he was being explicit about what his bias was in terms of approaching this question, but for the narrowness of how he was viewing this issue and how he actually didn't think, well, are you interested in what your constituents are going to think every 2 years when they're electing you, or at this moment when you're coming up with catch limits? Or are you interested in kind of what's going to sustain them over time, or, what's going to matter in terms of eventually if someone wants to do an offshore wind farm, or if someone wants to make sure that, spiny dogfish are, sustainable, or what have you. And so I just think it's very important that we look at these questions and that we ask them in the broadest sense possible. And so, and I think that, when I look at what's interesting, when I look at this question, and particularly I look at it over the, say 7 years that I have been covering this, what's interesting is that on a certain level, there are basically a very limited number of people who care about fisheries policy on a national scale, particularly in Washington. And what's interesting is that it's a very targeted lobbying effort. And again, so there are a bunch of people who care a lot, including particularly organized fishing interests. And then there are a few other people who tend to weigh in, whether it's environmentalists or scientists or things like that. And so when you see these fights play out, in a certain level, I think they're extremely consistent. And, things have not changed that much. The way the Recreation Fishing Association views this question is no different now from when I started this beat. But on a broader level, I do think, and this partially comes from my discussions having traveled the country for my book since it came out in June, is that I think people are reassessing how they view the ocean. And that on kind of a broader level, even if people are not engaged at the level that, again, people sitting in this room or sitting in Beaufort might be, that people are aware that there's more at stake than simply what they buy at a restaurant or what they see in the supermarket, and that they are seeing it in a slightly different way. Now, one of the things that I think is one of the biggest challenges, and I think I'm about to run out of time, is just that I want to leave it with, because I particularly feel like it's worth noting, given the opening comments of Ray, is that I cover everything including mining, oil drilling, all those things, grazing. Fisheries is the only, as far as I know, it is the only extraction of federal resources where you don't have to pay anything for what you're taking out. And, it is fascinating, and I think that really any discussion of this, you really can't separate it from the fact that there are a group of people who've been doing this for a couple hundred years in the U.S. context and haven't been paying anything for it. And that does, I think, drive the conversation in a way that's even kind of different from the way you have with traditional farming. And the last thing I would just say is that when people ask me how many sharks are dying each year, I can't say whether more sharks are being killed accidentally through bycatch or targeted for them specifically and for their fins. And that kind of lack of accountability is something that, again, is pretty unprecedented in what I cover. Most of the times, I can tell my readers what's the status of these kinds of things, and fisheries is perhaps one of the most information deficit fields that I ever cover. Thanks.
Well, very good, and thanks also for the opportunity to be here. My name is Richard Method. I work with NOAA Fisheries, and I've been working with NOAA for 30 years now. My base is on the West Coast. I've served in the Southwest, Alaska, and Northwest Fisheries Science Centers there, and now working for our Office of Science and Technology in Silver Spring, Maryland. I've been invested in this whole issue of the science behind determining and providing advice with regard to overfishing really throughout that time. In those first years in La Jolla, California, with the Southwest Center, we were working on the anchovy fishery management plan, the first plan put together under the Magnuson Act. One of the strong factors in that plan, anchovy is a forage fish, and one of the strong constituencies was the recreational fishing interests. They were very much interested in leaving enough anchovy in the water in order to sustain the fish that they were interested in. And so that plan, now over 30 years ago, already had in place some protocols to look at the frequency with which anchovy would decline in abundance as a factor. And so we were already attentive at that time to some of these issues with regard to ecosystem management and trying to look at these connections. I can't say that we've been able to address those sort of issues in all cases since then, but it is on the radar screen of the kind of things that we are very interested in looking at as we look at these fishery management plans. Another stint I had in NOAA was working out of the Alaska and then Northwest centers, where I was very involved with the West Coast groundfish, and there at a challenging time. It was the time when the 1996 Sustainable Fisheries Act was passed, which required that rebuilding plans be put in place for stocks determined to be overfished. Suddenly we had a realization that several of these stocks had declined in abundance. We had a new bit of legislation saying that they must be rebuilt in some time certain. And we also had a realization that the recruitment that was coming into these fish stocks was declining. It had been declining for several years, and we only now were getting enough information to realize that there weren't enough fish coming into the system right now to rebuild these stocks. We ended up with rebuilding plans that were stretched out to many decades in order to account for the amount of time it was expected to take for the stocks to rebuild the potential to complete that rebuilding plan. The Pacific Management Council at that time put in place some very stringent restrictions on the entire fishery in order to implement those rebuilding plans. So it was a very challenging time to put in place those plans, and the industry certainly went through significant short-term restrictions in order to implement those plans. More recently, in working now in science and technology, I'm involved with a number of national committees, and one of the things most recently was putting together the guidelines for implementation of National Standard 1 from the Magnuson-Stevens Act, the reauthorization of the Act in 2006 that put in place the requirement that there be annual catch limits such that overfishing does not occur in all fisheries. And that's a very strong requirement, and putting together the guidelines for that is the kind of thing where we brought together the science aspects of how well can we actually deliver the information to do that, as well as what it's going to take in order to put together the regulatory framework to make that happen. That now also is coming to full implementation. All the councils have put together the rebuilding plans, not rebuilding plans, the fishery management plan amendments in order to implement these annual catch limits. That's now in place, and we're now on with the full implementation stage. So let me talk a little bit about what does it mean to be ending overfishing. And so, at one stage, this reauthorization does end overfishing by saying that we cannot set limits that are beyond that level. But when you look in the rearview mirror, there still are ways in which it can happen. We still can find that we haven't controlled the fish catch enough each year in order to keep the catch below that limit. We can look a little further back as we update our science and realize that, there's always uncertainty in science. As we look in the rearview mirror, we'll find cases where the limits that we had set before no longer look like the accurate number that it is today. And you look a little bit further back, and even the body of science that we're using to provide that advice, it is limited in scope. It's tactical. It's really designed to answer those kind of questions. So as you take a more broader ecosystem perspective and try to look at what are this interaction of factors, and then are we really looking at all the cumulative impacts, we have another scale at which we really want to continue to put some attention at looking at these possibilities. Thanks.
I'm Mike Gorbach, a professor of marine affairs and policy here at the Nicholas School of the Environment at the Marine Laboratory. I'm an economist gone bad, and so I think I can rib Marty sometimes about economics. Into cultural anthropology, which is where I did my PhD out with the high seas tuna fleet in the West Coast. I did spend 3 years working with NOAA in the 70s to actually flesh out the Magnuson Act and worked with all 8 of the councils since then, so I suppose I'm culpable for whatever situation we think we're in here, a tiny bit. Bounced around to various universities, ended up here at Duke, and have spent a lot of my career actually working outside of the university. We spent 10 years as a fishery commissioner here in North Carolina, and have actually developed new fishery policies, always with the industry, bottom up with fishermen. So I see a lot of this from the industry perspective. I want to make 3 points. The first one is that fisheries management is never actually about science. It's always about human values. The question in any governance system is what should happen. And should is never a scientific question. It's always a human values governance question. So the issue is never really how many fish are actually out there at any given point in time, but how many fish do we want to be out there or not, and how do we want to use them? Do we think pristineness should be the standard, whether it's appropriate or not? Do we think it's the maximum number of fish or poundage that come out of the ocean or the maximum value of the fish that come out of the ocean? We still haven't resolved that particular question in most of our fisheries. Do we think recreational fishermen ought to catch it or commercial fishermen? Do we think that the U.S. ought to import seafood or so we can just play with it here or not, because that's a problem with other countries? Those are all should questions that are never scientific questions. Now, the impact of what we decide can be a scientific question, but what we ought to do is always a human values question that's really apart from the science itself. My second point goes to the question of are we turning the corner? And I think the answer is absolutely. You know, I lived half of my life, I'm a pretty old guy, but I lived half of my life with no federal fisheries management system in the United States at all. We didn't even have one before 1976. This is new. We're basically new at it. We've done a tremendous job at catching up. And I think we have a lot of success stories that you never hear very much about. This is a very interesting argument I have with the environmental community, who always focuses on the gloom and doom and the New England groundfish. Well, I will admit, is the black hole of fisheries management in this world. But why would we look at that as a model for anything when we have a lot of models of where we did it actually right? The striped bass is a great example on the Atlantic coast here. So I think the answer is yes. We're very much well positioned. We've made a lot of progress. Now, that varies a lot worldwide. Europe has a common fisheries policy. Not very well reviewed, but they've got it, where they didn't have it a couple of years ago. A lot of strides being made with world fish in Southeast Asia. So I think the answer is yes, especially in the U.S. We have done a tremendous job given a short time and not very many resources. One of my directors at NIMS was famous for pointing out that the entire budget of the National Marine Fisheries Service is what the Agricultural Department spends on milk for school lunches. We have no priority for fisheries in this country, and that point's been made on the panel already. My third point is about this, what's the title of this thing? A technical or political question. Students in my classes, hold your ears. It is always a political question. Nothing is non-political, ever, in governance, ever. If you hear the statement, let's get the politics out of it, we'll be okay, you're speaking nonsense, because everything involves trade-offs. I hope Boris picks this point up. Everything involves trade-offs. Laura Ray started out with this issue, whether it's land, sea, or recreational, commercial, or the ecosystem versus consumption. Everything involves trade-offs. It's always based on human values. That, by its definition, is a political process. So don't assume it shouldn't be political. If you want to be a good conservationist, get good at politics.
So, yeah, my name is Boris Warm. I live in an exotic place north of here that had 10 inches of snow yesterday. So I'm very happy to be here, and my brain is mush, and I want to lay on the beach. But I try to pull myself together. I work at a place called Halifax in Nova Scotia, Canada, at Dalhousie University. I'm a professor in marine conservation biology. And I come from a totally different angle. Well, first of all, I'm the only panelist who's not from the U.S. I'm originally from Europe, from Germany, and moved to Canada about 12 years ago. And my basic interest isn't really fisheries. It's how the oceans work. So trying to understand how ocean ecosystems function. And about halfway into my PhD, I realized I couldn't answer that question without looking at people. Because we are a major driving force of ocean change and ocean ecosystems, and we're firmly embedded in them, and I think obviously that won't change. But talking about trade-offs, I think we have to, as scientists, we have the obligations to explain the consequences of action and inaction to society so they can make those trade-offs in an informed way. And that means looking through more than one lens. So I said I'm interested in ecosystems. I studied ecosystems first in Europe, in the Baltic Sea, and it was notable that I did several years of field work there in the coastal ecosystem, and the largest fish I saw ever was an introduced goby about this size. And so I started thinking about how the ecosystem had changed since maybe 100 years ago or 500 years ago. Even 50 years ago, there was still a market for fresh caught bluefin tuna from the Kattegat, which is part of the Baltic Sea and the North Sea. There was swordfish coming into the Baltic. There was large cod stocks. There was salmon, none of which still existed in any large numbers at that time. Well, I moved on to Canada, which just was reeling from the collapse of its ground fishery. And certainly those circumstances influenced my perspective. You still had tuna and swordfish there, but they were far offshore, and cod and salmon were collapsed as they were in the Baltic Sea. Again, I wasn't so interested in the fisheries per se than in what this did to ecosystems. So I started to study the larger consequences of these changes to ecosystems, and I found that quite frequently the removal of one part of the ecosystem ripples through the system in what we call a cascading effect. Sometimes this has positive consequences, economically speaking, in that valuable shellfish stocks like shrimp and lobster do well. Sometimes the consequences are negative, like when coral reefs get overgrown by algae when you remove their grazers. Some of these changes, however, can be reversed. So I've seen a recovery of swordfish and some cod stocks in our region. What gives me especially hope is that I see the large change in public perception that Juliet elaborated on. And with that comes a change in market forces that I find nothing short but miraculous, how quickly that is changing fisheries in the region I live in and elsewhere. My worry is that these developments are largely confined to North America, Europe, and Australia, New Zealand. And in fact, some of the conservation successes that we've talked about here have been bought at the expense of displacing fishing effort and market demand to places that are less well regulated, particularly in the developing world. So when I travel the world, which I tend to do a lot of, my overall impression is that global fisheries, this is my central point, really are at a tipping point, at a watershed. But the problems are mounting. All the major indicators are still trending downwards. But we're understanding the root causes, and we're understanding the solutions that have to be implemented in order to fix this. And it is fixable. And it is being fixed in some places, and the U.S. would be a prime example of that. So just quickly, what are the solutions? One, engage the wider public into a broad vision of restoring the ocean. Second, rebuild depleted stocks. This would be, on average, worldwide between 30 and 40% of stocks. Third, safeguard productive stocks. Don't repeat the same mistakes on those 60 to 70% that we're still harvesting and that are still productive. And then last, protect vulnerable species and places like the sharks that Julia was talking about, which I work on a lot in Canada. Try to avoid bycatch and also look at places that are particularly vulnerable like reef systems and so on. So to finish up, is management working? Yes, it is in some places for some species, but we really have to take it to the next level. Thank you.
Thank you, Boris. Okay, so I'm going to tell you how this is going to work. We were going to open this up to the audience, but I have about 6 pages of questions, so I'm just going to, no, I'm just kidding. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to use 2 hand signals for you, and this works for you in Beaufort as well. If I point at you with a thumbs up, that means it's your turn to speak and turn on your microphone. If I point at you and my thumbs down, it means turn off your microphone. We're done. Okay. So we'll just look at that. And yes. Well, I thought of just doing thumbs up and thumbs down, but there's too much value associated with that kind of thing. Okay. So let's kick this off. We have in the audience today someone who works very closely with the Nicholas Institute through our Fisheries Forum and is also a member of the North Pacific Marine Fisheries Management Council, and John Hendersheet. So why don't you kick it off?
So I guess I'm on.
You're on.
So as someone who's sworn to uphold the national standards, I have to preface my question to say that this is intended as a hypothetical. But when I was listening to Dr. Hilborn and to others, I started thinking about the fact that we talk a lot about multi-species level management and ecosystem management, but we talk about in the U.S. about overfishing on a single stock basis. And so it caused me to ask whether overfishing can be part of ecosystem-based management. And that is to say that can there be times when managers could make a decision to overfish a particular species in order to achieve a greater economic yield? And again, I acknowledge that it's a hypothetical question, but I think it kind of fits with some of the comments that we heard this afternoon.
Panel? Marty?
So I think legally, no. we can't do that. I'm on the Mid-Atlantic Scientific and Statistical Committee. So you're not allowed to overfish something to increase the economic performance. You can only underfish it to increase the economic performance. So we kind of have designed this paradoxical situation where, on the one hand, we want to acknowledge economic value as something that has some normative credibility, but on the other hand, we don't really want to go down that road entirely. And so I think we'd be better off if we were willing to take that step and have a real discussion about what our objectives are, because right now it's more ecosystem considerations. That's an afterthought. Or we might be able to adjust yields or optimum yield. That's an afterthought. We can adjust down if it's very costly if the stock is small.
And where's the proper place to have that discussion?
Yeah. That's somebody else.
Well, some of that discussion can happen in the councils. The guidelines do, in principle, allow for some degree of looking at things on a multi-species basis in order to achieve the overall optimum yield. I mean, everything is cast in terms of benefits to the nation. And casting things at that level does provide some opportunity to look at it that way. And we also have situations where multiple species are aggregated together into complexes of fish stocks, and the management is at that complex level because we aren't able to drill down to the technical science to look at overfishing on a species-by-species basis. So we do end up stepping back a bit from the details in order to work on managing that complex as a whole as well as we can, recognizing that there will be cases inside of that where there will potentially be some degree that might be considered overfishing if you knew it, but you don't know enough in order to get to that level.
Oops. Okay. Can I get in the queue here after Mike?
Go ahead, Ray.
Go ahead, Ray.
Okay, I want to say two things with respect to this. One is that any ecosystem model will show you that if you want to maximize either the biological yield or the economic yield in mixed fisheries, you're almost certainly going to end up overfishing some stocks, the weak stocks. But when you look at the total ecosystem productivity, even a place like the West Coast groundfish, this paper we just published in Conservation Biology, there's no evidence that the total sustainable yield from the West Coast groundfish was ever reduced by overfishing, even though a number of stocks were reduced. That as an ecosystem, it continued to produce sustainable yield. The other point is that the U.S. law right now seems to be your objective is to not overfish anything, and yet you would expect in a long-term managing to reach sustainable yield, half your stocks would be above BMSY and half your stocks would be below BMSY, half your stocks would be above FMSY, half your stocks would be below FMSY if you were trying to achieve MSY. And we have just simply adopted, I think to a great extent by default, but some of it by design, very, very conservative targets that have some advantages in terms of leading to rapid rebuilding, but come at the cost of a lot of lost food production.
Just for the non-fishery people, BMSY is biomass, FMSY is fishing effort. Okay. So, it gets even worse because the law, for all the talk we have about ecosystem-based management, the law is not set up to do it at all. It's not only the fact that it does not allow us to fish down certain fish stocks that we may view as not necessarily undesirable. Dogfish in New England is a very good example of that. But there's no actually good mechanism to take into account ecosystem functions. Rick mentioned that the very first fishery management plan, which I was actually the plan reviewer on in Washington, D.C., established the forage fish concept as an adjustment to optimum yield, which is actually how they did it. It was an adjustment to optimum yield that reduced the commercial catch so the forage fish would be there for the recreational fishermen with the larger fish they wanted to catch. The very first fishery management plan. That mechanism, I don't believe, has been used for that ever since. And it gets more complicated when you talk about allocating things to marine mammals, or the whole issue of the menhaden and striped bass in the mid-Atlantic, which is not a federal fishery. Our policy system is not set up to allow for detailed allocations within the ecosystem. The Magnuson Act does not provide the administrative way to do that. So, in fact, if we want to do this thing called ecosystem management, a major impediment which is the biophysical ecologist won't tell us how many of each fish they want in the ocean, or they think should be in the ocean. If we want to do that, we have to really revise our administrative law system, not our statutory law system. Actually, both.
Just a quick comment. I don't think we can have it both ways. We can't commit to rebuilding fish stocks and ecosystems and then say, well, but maybe for those stocks we don't do it, we only do it for those stocks. If we do that, if we go down that road, we're back there where the country where I work in has been stuck for a long time. In that, in the end, the discretion is with the fishery minister to decide whether certain stocks get the benefit of a rebuilding plan and hard measures to achieve that, let alone timelines. We're not even talking about timelines, just going there at some point, and others don't. So if you don't have that commitment, you will not see the successes materialize that have materialized in this country precisely because the law is so stringent. So I don't think you can have it both ways. You can celebrate the successes and then say, but really we didn't mean it all that strongly.
Anybody else? Next question. Anybody in Beaufort? John. We'll get to my questions.
This one is less controversial.
Okay. Oh, we have some here. Good.
When we're talking about optimum yield, we, as managers, we tend to look at it on an annual basis. How much a variety of species are we catching? But either as fisheries managers or as economists, over what period of time do you think that decision makers should be thinking about optimum yield?
So this is one that really depends, and it's one where it's difficult to design a one-size-fits-all policy. If you're talking about a shrimp population, then you really have to think about what should the profile of fishing effort look like within the season, and we have a hard time with that. If you set up an annual catch share for shrimp, there's no reason to believe that you would solve the race to fish in that case, and so you would squander all kinds of economic value in spite of having the economic instrument. But if you look at long-lived species, you have to episodic recruitment species, things like that, you have to look over longer time horizons. If you start factoring in climate change and possible cycles in productivity, now maximum sustainable yield or maximum economic yield may be a moving target. So I think it really requires some thoughtfulness on the population biology of the fish and the economic structure of the fishery.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Again, there are examples of where we've taken very long-term objectives and built them into optimum yield. One of them, John, is in Alaska. The original Tanner crab plan had a maximum sustainable yield of about 100,000 metric tons, which was reduced by the council to 20,000 metric tons as optimum yield, that is the amount you could actually harvest. And the reason is they didn't want, at the time the fishery was largely a Japanese fishery, that is, everything went to the Japanese market. The U.S., the council, North Pacific Council, didn't want that fish going to the Japanese market caught by Japanese joint venture fishermen. So they put the optimum yield way down. And that was a plan for a decade because they wanted the U.S. industry to develop. So my answer is optimum yield should really always be conceptualized as a multi-year long-term question. I don't think it has in the past, but there are specific cases of where the plan has actually been decadal as it was reflected in the optimum yield decision.
Jim.
I add a little bit to that.
You have,
just a moment.
okay.
Yes, I certainly agree with that, Mike, that looking at optimum yield as a longer-term issue, and not only that, looking at it as a multi-species issue. I mean, there's been a tendency in the fishery management plans to define annual target catch on a per species and a per year basis and to call it optimum yield. But it's a different concept. The annual targets for the fishery are not the optimum yield. It is a longer term concept. And in order to bring the economic and fishing communities into that whole discussion of optimum yield, I don't see any way to do it on a single species basis. It really needs to be a broader perspective to talk about optimum yield. And perhaps even broader than individual fishery management plans. Maybe that as we begin working on fishery ecosystem plans within the Council, that'll be more the right forum to look with a broad enough perspective to get at the optimum yield.
Go ahead.
I just had to smile a little bit because a lot of what we talk about here is so particular to what happens in this country. So last year I was in Indonesia, which is the most biodiverse region on the planet. Anybody who dives should go there before they die, because you have to see this. But also what you will see is that those reefs get bombed out of existence, not by the people who live there actually, who tend to have their heads screwed on the right way because they depend on that place, but by others coming in at night and illegally. Shark finning is a big issue, and bomb fishing and the live reef fish trade. And you know, when you would talk to these people about optimum yield and balancing trade-offs, and so it's just about not having the place bombed to bits, right? So a lot of these problems, and sharks is another one, are not all that complicated, but they can get very complicated when you have all these different levels of objectives layered on top of one another, and various bureaucracies working through them. So I don't want to belittle what's happening here. It's beautiful in its own right, but it's just this tiny place.
So talk a little bit about that complexity, though, because one of the things we've seen in politics, I don't know if you're familiar with this analogy of the foxes and the hedgehogs, right, but people have different ways of viewing and dealing with complexity. Mm-hmm. And some people would rather deal with some certain basic principles and keep applying those principles over and over again. And we had someone wrote in about D'Onofrio's assertion that when we don't see the fish and we can't catch them, then we know there's overfishing. That's a pretty simple set of rules.
That's what he told me in an interview for the story that I did.
Right. So there's that. But then there's this other world where Marty was talking about maybe we should bring in climate change and all these other factors. So where is it that we find this social... Is my mic on? It was you. Okay. So how do we decide as a society how much complexity we can bring into these decisions? Or do we leave it up to the scientists to tell us what they can model? And Carl Safina wrote in and asked about ocean acidification, right? Some people don't believe in it. Some people in society don't believe in it. Climate change, Marty mentioned, some people don't believe in that too. How do we decide how much of that kind of environmental forcing factors should be part of the process of choosing these, whether we're overfishing these tacs?
Well, with acidification, we'll know the effects when the fish are gone. So, but maybe, just maybe, we can use our wits to anticipate that before it happens and give some hints to society, like we did with, say, not me, but some people did with, the scientific community did with ozone depletion, right? Like, we're frying ourselves out of existence, and maybe we should take some steps to avoid that. And the steps were taken, and it was by and large avoided. So I think it's the same here. And that's what I really see my job in. It's not maybe the day-to-day adjustment of management. It's those what we call horizon scanning issues, the things that are coming down the line, including some of those ecosystem effects that we really weren't aware of 5 or 10 years ago. So I think that's, and then as these things become known and appreciated as important, then they have to become part of management.
Let's go to Juliet, and then we'll come back to Mike.
Yeah, and I just think, I mean, again, obviously, I think that part of how you do that is by sharing this information, and then again, policymakers and the public make their decisions about it. You know, in other words, for example, with ocean acidification, I'm working on a series this year about climate adaptation, and one of the things that's on my list to do is to look at, you know, how NOAA is dealing with oyster farmers in the Pacific Northwest in terms of helping them with adaptation, and how are they dealing with more acid oceans, and what implications does that have. This is a fairly, you know, one might say that's not the most controversial thing that the Obama administration is doing on climate, because, you know, there's a very obvious constituency, and you can talk about the obvious economic benefits of doing something like that. But again, this administration has made a decision. By June, every single federal agency will have to outline how they're incorporating climate change into what they do and how they plan. And so obviously some people can still say it's not real, but, you know, this government has made that decision, and we'll see what kind of blowback they get for it. And just sorry, were you going to ask a question?
No.
Yeah. Just saying one last thing, just in terms of what Boris just mentioned about the ornamental fish trade, and I do think I happen, again, to be working on a story on this right now. Obviously, this is, although I guess it's interesting when you say overfishing, that can apply to aquaria species as well. You know, what's very interesting about that is I'm doing a story about this tension between, you know, can there basically be aquaculture on a scale for marine ornamental species that could actually have some impact on the wild trade, and again, some of the impacts of fishing for the wild trade. One of the really interesting things, having just, for example, done an interview today in between my meetings with someone who runs an ornamental fish farming operation in Florida, is that he can raise a lot of these species. Sometimes they cost 4 times as much as catching it wild, doing cyanide bombing and other practices. So again, that becomes a consumer question. Can you basically provide enough information to the public that when a family is deciding to get a cute little clownfish or goby for their kid, do they say, I'm willing to spend $25 instead of $5 to get a fish that, A, we all know is going to be dead within a very short period of time, because these things don't last that long, but are they willing to do it because they know that reefs aren't going to suffer the consequences in Indonesia? So those are the kind of questions that I think need to be explored.
And I was just going to ask you about your Barney Frank example. So, you know, you say give the policymakers more information.
Right.
It wouldn't make any difference to Barney Frank because he has a constituency.
Ray, I tried.
That may be different. And so when we talk about giving people information, and this gets back to who should make these societal decisions, because a representative has a different time frame than a senator. And not everyone on the council is charged with thinking about society's well-being overall, you know, type.
Right, but the one thing that I would say is that, again, and I think this really does apply to fisheries policy, there are a small number of people in Washington who are very intense about it, and the vast majority of people who are in these positions don't think about it at all. So if actually those people could probably be swayed by the public in one way or another. So while someone like Barney Frank and the member of Congress who's going to replace him might, you know, basically answer to one constituency, the fact of the matter is you can see significant shifts, as we saw in the Magnuson reauthorization in 2006, because basically you had, again, a Republican president work with, enough members of Congress and actually saw a very significant policy shift.
I think sometimes the art also is not getting too fancy. In my view, most of the major fishery issues we faced in this country, and I think it's probably true in most other countries as well, are simple matters of political will and adjusting the fishing effort and the fishing mortality. It's not damn rocket science, and you can do it on the basis of a fairly simple set of indices. In this country, what we've tended to do is to say, oh, we've overfished fish stocks. The solution is do ecosystem management. An analogy I make is a couple who are having trouble with their marriage, and some marriage counselor says, I know, to solve your problems with each other, have some kids. Right? That'll make it better. It's just nonsense. It makes the system much more complicated. Now, does that mean we shouldn't be managing other parts of the ecosystem, water quality and habitat? Sure we should. But to solve the relatively straightforward problem of overfishing certain single-species fish stocks, reduce the damn effort. And in many cases, you should reduce the people and have a lap program as well. It's just not rocket science. Let's not make it more complicated than it needs to be to solve certain specific objectives.
Marnie.
Just to go back to Boris's comment about Indonesia and the contrast with sort of fine-tuning policy instruments in this country, both of them are fundamentally about exclusion. You have to exclude people from access to the commons. And in this country, we've kind of, on a first-order level, we've done that. And so we can talk about sort of fine-tuning and other ways of generating value. But if you've got outsiders coming in and dynamiting reefs, then you haven't even begun to solve the first-order exclusion problem. And that's the question. And I guess I'm really interested in Juliet's optimism about this, about market forces solving these problems, because I really, I would like to believe that people will be willing to pay more for sustainably grown aquarium fish and so forth. But there are profound free rider problems there. They have that solution doesn't solve the exclusion problem in Indonesia. It may adjust prices or things like that. It may make it less profitable to do that, but it might not make it completely unprofitable. And so I guess that's the question that all of us are asking about the sustainable seafood movement and where all that's headed and so forth.
Oh, Jim. Sorry, that's right. We missed you. No, you had your hand up a long time ago. Okay.
My name is Jim Salzman. I teach environmental law, and I actually have a class on fisheries, both when I teach natural resources law and international environmental, and the students are always just blown away when I give them the basic statistics on bycatch. And I was curious if the group could talk about where they see sort of bycatch regulation, or at least dampening, sort of moving forward. I mean, it seems that to a certain extent it's a technology problem, because you can't really know what's going on in the net unless you're actually out on the boat. And I don't know if remote sensing is a way to get at it, or Mike, you were talking about proxies or indices. But if meaningfully reducing bycatch is something that's in the offing.
So I think one of the speakers made the comment that there needs to be a price on bycatch. Basically, it needs to be de-incentivized more. So I mean, nobody wants to have bycatch because it's a hassle. But if it's not strongly de-incentivized, it may be just easier, maybe just for some operators to have that bycatch in order, because it's just simpler or whatever. In Western Canada, for reasons I don't understand, but I think it had to do with scientists actually going directly to the industry and working with them directly. A system was devised where there was a quota on bycatch, and that quota was tradable. And there was 100% observer coverage, which is the trick. You need that because only the bycatch that's counted counts. And but that was implemented, some of it with robots, basically, not with real people. And it turned out that some people are just incredibly good at avoiding bycatch, and those people are rewarded, and they're sometimes making more money from the fish they do not fish than the fish they do fish. And I think that's just that's a wonderful system. But comes back to Juliet's.
I think you turned yourself off.
Comes back to Juliet's point that if you do something and you're not paying for it, you're not used to pay for it, then all of a sudden to have to pay for your bycatch obviously is not very attractive. So there's some hurdles to overcome there. But come back to ecosystem management, I think this is a first-order problem, because these are species just as our target species, and we have a commitment not to overfish them, not to drive them, to deplete them too much. So this problem has to be dealt with, but there need to be incentives to deal with it.
Well, I think part of the problem is just getting the good understanding of how much bycatch is happening and how much different species can sustain. Because it varies greatly from sharks at one extreme to pelagic octopus on the other. The rate at which they could be bycaught in another fishery, a target fishery, varies tremendously. So you need to know what the rates are as well as what they can sustain, because at one point it's really just a multi-species issue. The dividing line between what is a multi-species fishery and what is a situation where you have a target species and bycatch in that, there's no sharp line between those two. There's a tendency to try to think about reducing bycatch, and certainly we need to keep the bycatch low enough so that we're not harming the stocks, but thinking of it also as a multi-species problem and full utilization of the mix of species that get caught together can be more efficient, as well as it is a good use of all those species.
Yeah, again, the bycatch provision standard of the Magnuson Act was not added until later, but it was added later, and I think there's been some progress in that. I mean, whether it's turtle excluder devices or finfish fish excluder devices. But John, can I pirate your little story about the salmon in terms of an interesting effect? Now, you want to tell it?
About the costs?
Yeah. Just tell this little anecdote. This is a very interesting, what I would call it an interesting side effect of a bycatch regulation.
So in 2011, a regulation went into place in the Bering Sea to reduce the bycatch of Chinook salmon. And it was designed in a way that allowed the fleet to come up with their own incentives. It simply set a performance standard. The pollock fleet, so one of the largest fisheries in the U.S. The council simply established a performance standard, and if the fleet failed to meet that performance standard, then the cap that would shut down the fishery when that cap was reached on an annual basis would be lowered. So this has been a big change for the fleet, and enough that the fleet is now realizing that there's been a cost to not sharing their cost data. Because at this point, they want very much to be able to demonstrate and describe how costly this is, how much extra fuel they're burning in order to avoid these fish, but it's anecdotal. There are no cost data being collected, and so it's sort of giving the industry a different look at the value of economic data. Does that cover what you...
Yeah, thanks.
Liza, if anyone there in Beaufort has a question, you'll have to get up and go to the mic. So we'll go to you next. Go ahead, Liza. Oh, Ray.
Could I just say something on the bycatch issue?
Yes, please.
Okay. This follows up on what Boris said. I think that bycatch problems are actually among some of the easiest ones to solve, but the incentives have to be right, and we have to find ways to either, depending on your perspective, penalize bycatch or provide benefits to those who don't. But there's just dozens and dozens of lessons of how it can easily be solved. But one of the foundations is you have to know what it is, and I think it's becoming increasingly clear that the fisheries just have to start to accept some form of observation as a routine part of fisheries, whether it's onboard observers, electronic observers, etc. That's just, you can't really claim that you know what's going on unless you have very intensive observer coverage. So the Western Canadians, as Boris said, went into 100% observer coverage. The U.S. West Coast trawl fleet went into it this year, and they were terrified that they were going to hit the limits on some of these rebuilding stocks. And the latest data I've seen suggested they were unbelievably successful at avoiding them. Part of it was by not catching all the other stocks, but some of the stocks they caught something like 5% of the quota of species that were thought to be highly limiting, simply because the whole fleet just didn't go to places they were going to catch those species. There probably was cost to it, but those problems are solvable, but we have to know what's going on and we have to provide the right incentives.
Okay, good. Let's go to Morgan, because she's been standing up for God knows how long, and then we'll come back to you, Liza. So Morgan, go ahead.
The microphone working?
It is.
So I have a question, changing the subject slightly, which has to do with the cost of management. I've often heard people bandying this about, and I don't know how true it is, and obviously it must vary from fishery to fishery, but if you add up all the costs of running nymphs and doing all the stock assessments and vessel monitoring systems and the observers and on, all the costs associated with fisheries management, my guess is that in some fisheries it exceeds the value of the fish being caught. Do any of you have any actual information about that? How much is it fishery by fishery, and how about overall for all the United States? I mean, I imagine some fisheries do exceed their management costs.
Well, you're right in saying that it varies tremendously from fishery to fishery and fish stock to fish stock, and adding it up is probably a more reasonable way to approach that issue, because not only do we have the we mandate to be looking at the individual stocks, we're also trying to look across the ecosystems and provide that overall protection. So you really need to look at the monitoring programs across that suite. It's also true that most of the monitoring programs really do provide information on a wide range of species. So trying to drill it down to a per species basis really, I don't think addresses the question very well. When you do look at it at a multi-species basis and across the region, there certainly are examples where the value of getting a survey every year rather than every other year, or being able to provide this monitoring, is going to give us benefits that will be far greater than what the cost is of that addition.
We've lost the microphone there again.
My mic's working. I'll comment on that.
Yeah, she's going to get a new one. Go ahead, Ray. How's your battery?
Yeah, I think mine's working fine. When I worked for the Canadian Department of Fisheries between 1975 and 1980, the budget of the Canadian Department of Fisheries was greater than the landed value of fish in the country. That's changed a lot. It's still true in Canada. They spend far more on salmon management than the value of salmon from a landed value perspective, but there's enormous cultural and native issues there. New Zealand is one of the countries where they essentially recover all of their costs of management from the commercial fishery. And there, I think it's on the order of a little less than 10% of the total landed value of commercial fish stocks is the cost of the management system, all the data collection, et cetera. When I worked in the Western Pacific, the research management system, now this is again 25 years ago, was on the order of 1% of the landed value. So I think you'll find every imaginable example, and it's a very interesting question, which is, what's the right amount?
Well, and I think also to address this issue, we're going to have to engage in a real cultural shift about how we think about the ocean. I mean, the ocean really has been, it's the last black hole of policy on the planet. We regulate airlines and airways better than we regulate the ocean. And there are fishermen still in this country who don't think they should have to supply information to the National Marine Fisheries Service. These are the same people who, to this day, refuse to take observers and get away with it. And, as Juliet pointed out, don't pay for the privilege of taking a public trust resource. Marine fisheries are the only public trust resource in this country that does not pay public trust compensation. And it does now in limited forms in limited access fisheries, but only in a very limited form. So, and why is that? It's because, in part, the fisheries industry has always lobbied for this on the basis of this old freedom of the seas notion. We should all be able to do what we want out in the ocean. That needs to stop. And until it stops, we will not be able to elaborate the systems in the way that New Zealand and some of these other places have, or that we have on land.
I just have a follow-up question for Rick, being the journalist, because you didn't answer the question. Can you identify a fishery in the United States where we spend more money regulating it than it produces in landed catch, the way that Ray identified for some Canadian ones? Is there anyone that comes off the top of your head, whether you're talking about a complex or a specific species? Where, in other words, our public investment in regulating it is cost taxpayers more money than this country is getting in terms of benefits from the economic impact of that fishery.
I don't think we've ever put together the information in exactly that way. Again, trying to look at things across the board is the way we consider the resources. So I don't think I have an example that would fall into that category. I think we certainly do recognize that the ratio of cost to of conducting the monitoring and to providing the analytical framework and providing the regulation is not something that scales with the value of the resource. There's no doubt about it that there are valuable resources where the information you need in order to manage it is not going to go up at the same rate as the value of the resource. There will be a crossover point. I don't know where it's at.
I think a general rule, though, is that fish stocks that have gone down dramatically in abundance and may be endangered incur very large management costs, and those fisheries that are doing relatively well, for example, those in New Zealand, incur relatively little management costs simply because it's relatively easy to manage them when they're still abundant, and it's really hard to recover them when they're crashed. So salmon for example, in the Bay of Fundy is an endangered stock in Canada, or salmon in Europe for that matter, where there's efforts to bring the species back in some of the major river systems, amounts to costs of hundreds of thousands of dollars per fish to bring those things back. So it gets very costly, and this is one of the reasons for avoiding overfishing.
One more small one. Going back to Marty's point, until we have limited access systems, we will not have enough net value in the fisheries to extract for these purposes. We've dissipated that through open access historically. We designed a fishery system in South Florida for spiny lobster that does, in fact, produce it's a cost recovery system completely, but it's a limited access, and it's very unlikely to get that situation unless you have true limited access.
So I just want to use an example of butterfish to make the point that this ecosystem perspective is sort of unavoidable. And it's a fishery that used to have a directed fishery, but now it's principally just a bycatch fishery. So butterfish is caught and bycatch in the squid fishery. So we're managing butterfish and setting limits on butterfish, which you could say, because there's not a directed fishery, what's the value of that? But of course, the opportunity cost is the squid fishery that it's caught in. So how do you say, we're spending too much money on butterfish when we're not landing it per se as a target fishery, but in fact it's connected to this other valuable fishery? And I think that's an example where that question is problematic.
I don't think it's problematic because it's a cost to the squid fishery. If you didn't have any squid fishing going on, you wouldn't have to expend those resources. So that cost should just be applied to the cost of having a fishery where you're allowing people to take squid. That's what I'd say for that.
So my question goes back to something that Boris said. You mentioned that good management practices in the U.S. and Canada and other places sort of leads to these spillover effects in countries where regulations might not be as stringent. So like a management success here would result in overfishing somewhere else. And I was wondering if you could expand upon that and sort of explain that connection and sort of any other examples of how our management here sort of impacts what's happening globally.
Well, I think Marty told me some fascinating things about capital that sloshes around. So that's the economic perspective. A really well-documented example is European fleets overfishing in West Africa. So this had to do with the depletion of stocks in Europe and more stringent management, probably both. And there just was a lot of excess capacity, much of it financed by the European Union, basically as a make-work program. And that capacity, boats and people, had to go elsewhere. So they bought fishing rights in West Africa and caused massive overfishing there. So and then it moves elsewhere, increasingly East Africa and other places. So those things are relatively well documented. But the economic perspective I found also really interesting. Do you want to talk about that, Marty?
Well, yeah, this is you're asking a question about Sam's master's project back there. I think Sam's still there. Yeah. So he's actually studying this specific question of does rationalization in New England cause spillovers into the Mid-Atlantic? So is a success, or what appears to be a successful program in one place, does it have consequences? Because if there's excess fishing effort there that's now available to fish elsewhere, and it's not prevented from doing that, does that happen? So we're still working on preliminary results, so I won't get into too many details. But I also think your question raises this issue of aquaculture that I brought up in my opening remarks and no one more seems to want to talk about. But from my point of view, we have a bit of a regulatory void in this country on aquaculture. If I wanted to start aquaculture, where would I do? How would I do it? Like, who would be regulating me and so forth? So in a way, we've sort of punted on aquaculture, at least in the past we have, and that's allowed it to grow vibrantly in many other parts of the world. So, and we're eating that fish. We're importing that fish here. So do we want to take charge and say we could have an aquaculture industry and we could regulate it the way we want? Or are we content with importing farmed fish from elsewhere, some of which might be farmed very sustainably and environmentally friendly manner, but others we may have issues or reservations about?
Well, I guess I have a somewhat related question, but there's been a lot of talk about the need for to look at the big picture and worldwide connections between different economic and ecological processes.
Noelle, take one giant step forward. There you go. Steven Tyler. There you go.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Yes?
See, we.
Okay. So there's been a lot of talk about the need to look at the big picture and worldwide connections between different economic and ecological processes, and I think that's really important, but I'm also curious. A lot of fishing is still fairly regional and small scale, and I'm just wondering how you see science and management both evolving to take into account these sort of large-scale connections, but also pay attention to more small-scale local realities.
The area that came in. So the area beyond jurisdictions. Yeah.
So for small-scale fisheries, I can talk about the lobster fishery because it's a good example for one that has enormous benefits in the order of 600 million per year in Canada, Eastern Canada, and the management costs are minuscule because it's basically only managed by trap limits that have been constant for 25 years, and it's just doing relatively well with that. Now, the fishery, though, has a management structure that's kind of hidden, and that's you could say turfs, the traditional turfs that individual fishermen have where they fish, and they defend those against others. So there's a spatial management aspect that's not official, it's not imposed by the government, but kind of agreed upon through tradition by the community. And increasingly, experience shows that those kind of spatial management regimes that are enforced and to some extent created by the community are an effective way of managing small-scale fisheries in Eastern Canada, but around the world, particularly in developing countries, where you really can't do the type of top-down, very precise management that we're attempting in large-scale industrialized fisheries.
Yeah, I think it's true that turfs and other traditional mechanisms can work in certain situations. Fiji is a good example of that, where you don't have tremendous overpopulation problems, where you have basically viable fisheries. I think the problem looks real different when you get into India, into parts of Indonesia, where you simply have so many fishers fishing after a resource with so few other alternatives and such a high subsistence dependence on the harvest, which is not true in things like the lobster fishery, that it's a totally different kind of problem. And it really leads you to the question of how many problems you can solve through fisheries management, as opposed to needing to do something else entirely different, like try to provide some economic and social, and I'm going to use the word development, so that people have different alternatives for their lives entirely than trying to rely on fishing. And in many of the questions, I think that situations I think Noelle is bringing up, that's going to be the answer as opposed to anything we do in fisheries management.
Very quick anecdote from Kenya. My friend Tim McClanahan. One such alternative is build schools, because a lot of the excess fishing effort that was causing the problems you're describing was kids who really should have been in school, but there was no school. So they built a school and got those kids educated and got them out of the fishery, and that worked towards solving that problem.
So you kind of addressed this when you were talking about limited access programs, but especially for those of us who are interested in entering the management kind of field, what would you recommend when there is a problem where human values oppose the economic values that you get from modeling? Should the economic model then incorporate these maybe non-rational, in an economic sense, human values, or should the economics be encouraged enough that human values reflect that? Like, how would you reconcile those differences?
Never, ever use the word rational. That's the first rule. Never, ever use the word rational. All decision-making processes at every level of policy, fisheries, and everything else always combine biophysical variables, economic variables, social variables. The question is, how well are they represented, and how do you array them against each other? Now, Marty and I often have discussions about how much of it you can model in an optimality model, type model, to great benefit. My answer is, you can show certain relationships among certain things, but probably not enough to ultimately actually make decisions. What you have to do is be able to manage the social process, manage the process of building consensus and having people agree with whatever information is in front of them. That's a process I think we teach very little about in the schools of the environment, and is in fact what most resource managers actually end up doing, is trying to manage conversations and social processes. So to me, the answer to your question is, label the variables and talk about what information you have on them, but realize that you're not going to have a model to give you the answer. You're going to have a social process that you have to manage to give you the answer.
Yeah. Let me just, another way of thinking about your question is, we like market incentives when they align with our personal beliefs about what we think is important, and we tend to think market incentives or people's economic preferences will lead to sustainability. But there's nothing that guarantees that, right? So what you're really asking is, what do we do, right, when they don't line up, and who represents those non-economic interests?
So I'm not going to rehash every argument Mike and I have ever had about modeling, but I guess I think this is a great question, and I think my first answer to it is to be thoughtful about it and be aware that these are real issues, and that may not sound much like Marty the economist, but I do think it's worth saying, suppose you had two lemonade stands and one sold $100 worth of lemonade and had $50 worth of costs, and the other one sold $100 worth of lemonade and had $100 worth of costs. Which one would you rather own? And I think that's, we live in a market economy. If you'd rather own the one that had $100 worth of costs, it's really going to be tough to do anything in fisheries management or anything else that's going to keep you in business. So I think there's some realities, but you obviously can't, tell people this story exactly in those words when you're dealing with these human values and so forth. So, but keep them in the back of your mind.
But there are potentially some things that you can use as tools to look at that. I mean, there is a whole body of work on basically game theory, on how are people going to react in situations. And it's a different sort of modeling. It's not the kind of quantitative biophysical economic models that we've been talking about mostly here, but it still is a way to try to organize your thinking about how are people going to react and how are the systems going to react. And so I wouldn't foreclose the thinking about trying to provide some degree of advice on how is the system likely to evolve if you make this action or that action. And I agree with Mike that you are working to manage the process. I think you need to feed into it some degree of forecasting of where the process is likely to take you.
There. Hi, thanks. I'm John Bruno, and I just wanted to ask the panel to maybe scale this up to an international level, and Boris has kind of touched on this, both in terms like Marty's brought up with fish farming, so only about 10% of the fish consumed in the U.S. is caught in the U.S., so a lot of the policy issues you're talking about don't really apply to most of the fish we're all eating. Most of it, 85, 87% of the fish is imported,
Like low 80.
Well, according to NOAA, 84%, whatever, 80%, and most that's farmed, right? So most that's farmed in Asia and other parts of the world. So none of that fish is under the purview of the kind of regulatory mechanisms you're talking about. And most of the fishing problems I see in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific is illegal fishing. So again, it's not really fishing that's manageable under legal structures like this, whether it's shark fishing in the Galapagos or poaching in marine reserves in Belize or the Bahamas. And, that illegal fishing is driven by global marketplaces, right? So the sharks are going to China. The shrimp from illegal mangrove deforestation in coastal Ecuador is coming to U.S. markets. So it's just become this global marketplace for fish and fishing. And how can we get to the point where we can manage things globally? Will NOAA someday have purview over, how fish are being grown in China or being caught in Ecuador that get imported to the U.S.?
Will NOAA have purview? No. What purview?
We also had a question that's very similar to that, not about aquaculture, but it's, we've talked about us bringing in imported seafood, but Stephanie Ware at the Nature Conservancy asks, what about all of these fishing boats from developed countries that are fishing illegally? That's also market-driven, and how do we address that sort of issue as well?
So, John, your question's a great one, and I really don't. I struggle with it because I don't have an answer for it. I mean, why can't we just regulate climate change internationally, right? I mean, it's not quite the scale of that, but it's a similar kind of problem. The level of international cooperation and agreement that you would require. I guess a few things that I'd like to toss out there. One is we can use money to help subsidize operations that are doing a good job and insist on traceability and then try to get markets and people's willingness to pay for more for sustainability, try to get that to work. That's optimistic that would solve problems, but it might be a starting place. There might be some rather extreme situations where we would even consider trade policy. I think that's unlikely to work in most cases because you wouldn't be able to drill down to individual operations or individual countries that are doing a good enough job or not good enough job. But there could be examples where we would think about that. The other thing I think we have to keep in mind is anything that we do to try to put a lid on this stuff is going to have human consequences that are immediate in terms. So, we talk about this sort of long-term sustainability, seafood, and so forth, but we also have to keep in mind that there are a lot of people out there in the world living on less than $1 a day, and maybe some of that is at some cost to the ecosystem that we have to tolerate. So I don't know the answer, but I think it's a really great question to think about.
We have instruments that can address things like that. The Lacey Act, CITES, Rick mentioned a minute ago. We have made some progress in things like that internationally. Part of the issue, again, is getting attention on the problem in the ocean. We regulate lots of things internationally to great detail that are no more difficult technically to do than it would be to try and actually track industrialized nation fishing boats around the world. We should be able to do that dead easily. We do it with little things that float around in space, But we don't devote the resources to it. So I think we need more development of our policy instruments. We need much more attention to things like the RFMOs, which are notably not very effective, but are in other arenas outside of fisheries. The question is why. That's an interesting question. Morgan Gopnik down at the lab is looking at that kind of question right now. We need further development of the policy instruments, and we need, again, better incentives to provide the resources to the problem, because it's not an insoluble technical problem. It's a problem we haven't applied the resources to solve it.
Doesn't it also come down to how hypercritical you can be? So one question I had, I just read a report, and maybe we can confirm that or not, but that the tuna talks in the West Pacific just broke down because there was a push by the affected countries who own those tuna stocks to have certain fishing methods scaled down that have a lot of bycatch. And apparently, Asian countries were willing to do this, but Europeans and U.S. were not, and that's why the talks broke down. And I don't understand why we're protecting every little rockfish off California, but then allow our fleets to go elsewhere and employ practices that are not regarded as best practices. Is anyone aware of this, or?
Well, there isn't a U.S. tuna fleet anymore.
Well, there's foreign access.
Yeah, but there are only 5 tuna boats still registered in the U.S. All of them are registered in foreign countries, so we don't actually have any control over those anymore in terms of the tuna fishery. Maybe Ray, do you have thoughts on the tuna situation? But it's not an issue where the U.S. has any control over a fleet out there anymore.
Although the U.S. still does negotiate access agreements with the foreign fisheries countries, and that's part of the mix. But the U.S. has, I think, an incredibly hypocritical track record. When I worked in the Western Pacific, the U.S. didn't recognize 200-mile zones, and in fact, a U.S. seiner was caught. Juliet Eilperin was caught in Solomon Island waters back in the 80s, and U.S. law specified that any fines of that vessel would be paid out of any foreign aid the U.S. gave to that country. If you ever, I've got a video I show classes here that was an Australian documentary on that whole story in the Western Pacific in the 80s, and it was shocking what U.S. foreign policy was at that time. And that was a time there were only about 40 Americans employed in the tuna fleet. That they were almost everybody involved was from some other country. But right now there's a Greenpeace, for instance, been pushing to stop purse seine fishing on fads because there's a lot of bycatch of other species, and they've actually convinced many European retailers to only sell pole and line caught tuna. It's very clear that you cannot catch most, the 10 million tons of tuna by pole and line. That maybe the maximum world catch of tuna by pole and line to be about 1 million. And there's a report that just came out from Peter Tidemeers, who's at Dalhousie, Boris's university, is sort of the world's expert on fisheries and energy, showing that the greenhouse gas footprint of pole and line is about 5 times higher than the greenhouse gas footprint per ton of purse seine. So it is a complicated issue, and it depends on which dimension you look at, which way you should go.
But I think there's also good news, and again, I'm the internal optimist. I recognize that there's good news here from the governance sense, because the Pacific Island nations are now asserting their authority and their rights. They are now, whether it's through the Western Pacific Fisheries Commission, through the Micronesian Challenge, whatever it is, they're getting together and saying, you want to fish in our territory, you got to do some things here. That's good. They have not done that before. Now, it may not work the first time around. There may be a lot of resistance from other places, but they're doing it. That, to me, is good news.
Let's go to Tom in Beaufort.
Y'all ready for me?
We're ready.
My name's Tom Roller. I'm an owner of a recreational-based fishing business, and since we haven't talked much about recreational fishing, I want to ask a question about that. When we talk about optimal yield, we still tend to focus on maximizing yield, but recreational anglers often value things other than yield, like higher abundance and larger fish. How might a different definition of optimal change our view of what a rebuilt fishery should look like?
Well, Tom, I think there's plenty of opportunity and expectation that we do move in that direction of taking a broader view of what optimum yield means, so that it is inclusive of all potential uses. Finding a way to quantify that in a way that will lead to a way to balance the uses is going to be much harder. But I think the issue of recognizing the opportunities that are for fishing recreationally are potentially going to have a different sort of looking stock than those that would be supporting commercial fishery. That is important. It is something that can be looked at in the context of optimum yield.
I'll jump in here if I can. Within the fisheries modeling kind of business that Rick and I deal with, that we know how to deal with those problems. You would tell us, how much bigger, the value of larger fish, the value of higher catch rates. But where I see the real challenges in recreational fishing at the moment is, recreational fishing is really about the opportunity to go fish and how much fishing effort you get. And my understanding is in some parts of the country, particularly the southeast, that recreational fishing opportunity is being choked down to very low levels or almost nothing because of rebuilding requirements for gag grouper and a few things. I haven't been involved down there directly, but but it's, we've got to figure out how to deal with these mixed stock fisheries when you have some stocks that are at low abundance, and probably find the same kind of solution we have for rockfish on the west coast, where you find a way to get avoid catching the species that need rebuilding while still allowing recreational fishing opportunity on the species that are abundant enough to support a fishery.
Yeah, I think we have to be a little careful because even though it may not have been reflected in optimum yield language, many of our major fish stocks, and including the South Atlantic, are majority allocated to recreational fishing. Tom, I think recognizing the kinds of values, although they may not have been quantified very well, that you're talking about here. Striped bass, king of Spanish mackerel, over half of the coastwide stocks of those are actually allocated to recreational fishermen. And in the case of federal plans, like king of Spanish mackerel, have to be expressed in terms of optimum yield. Now, do we do that enough in enough fisheries? I'm not sure. But there's also a sort of a perverse political thing going on here, and this is the phenomena of recreational fishermen being mad about being excluded from marine protected areas and creating things like the Recreational Fishing Alliance, what's the other one called? The RFA, there are a number of groups now that are essentially saying recreation isn't the problem, commerce is the problem, don't restrict us. There are states in this country who don't have saltwater recreational fishing licenses because their people have lobbied to say, don't bother regulating us recreational people. So on the one hand, recreational interests have been incredibly successful in some parts of the fishery management process. On the other hand, more recently, they've been incredibly antagonistic. I'm not sure if that's right or wrong, but it's happening.
Yeah, I think recreational. Can I just follow up?
Yeah, go ahead.
Recreational fishing is interesting because they obviously have a lot of political power because they are so abundant, but they just never seem to be really on top of the issue. So I've had a couple of recreational fishermen from the South sort of bombarding me with how the Environmental Defense Fund and catch shares are ruining the fisheries of Florida. And the more I talk to them, the more I realize that their problem was, as I just mentioned earlier, this gag grouper problem that's basically being influenced by the 10-year rebuilding requirement. It has nothing to do with catch shares, nothing to at all. And yet, that was the first thing. Oh, these catch shares are killing us. And I'd really like to see recreational fishing groups get better organized and get better science input and participate more in the management process. It seems to me that that's a big need.
Let me just note that Tom, who asked the question, is one of the very informed recreational fishing people. So none of our responses reflect anything on Tom here.
Yeah, just to follow up on Ray's point, I think we need to be willing to have a discussion about how to divide up this pie between the commercial and the recreational sectors. I mean, that's really what's driving it. I don't think it's necessarily it has nothing to do with catch shares, as you suggest. Another way of looking at it is if you have catch shares, then you've organized a group, and now they're invested in that stock, and they're going to be invested in their slice of the pie as a commercial group. And the rec sector, over time, in some fisheries, has gotten a larger and larger slice of the pie because the commercial sector has been totally in disarray, and the only control managers have is to restrict the commercial sector. Now, that's not true in all cases, but that's another way of looking at the same problem. So the solution isn't to say more for the rec sector, more for the commercial sector. The solution is to figure out how we're going to divide up the pie and try to move from there.
One of the impacts that I also see to the overfishing problem that I haven't really heard discussed quite as much here is problems with expansion, whether it be to deeper waters, newer species, particularly in lower trophic levels, or to new areas where there truly isn't any fishing. And so I just wanted to hear some thoughts on that, and maybe as a kind of an applied game. I think we have a tremendous opportunity with the Arctic Ocean where there's no fishing and historically, and really no infrastructure for fishing, but with increasing ice-free winters and ever expanding fishing fleets, that's going to be a place where fisheries management, I think, has a tremendous challenge both on the national and international scale. And so maybe we can just use that to get into the question of expansions.
Well, there certainly have been some examples, and that's a good one, of basically taking a stance, and the North Pacific Council did this, putting in place a plan that would not allow that to be developed until it could be shown that basically it's safe to do so. And there's been other cases where plans have been put in place on the West Coast for the possibility of fishing another forage species, krill. Pacific Council took the approach of banning harvest of krill when there wasn't even a fishery, but there was a potential that one might start, and they took an approach there of not allowing that to happen. So, I think that it is possible to take that sort of an approach, and there's in the Arctic they've been able to do that, and in other cases there really aren't, that I know of, very many opportunities for further expansion within the 200-mile zone. There's probably some deep water opportunity, but it's limited. And elsewhere in the world, probably more opportunities for that to be happening. But within the U.S. waters, that's probably not our biggest issue of that sort of expansion.
So just from the Canadian perspective, not that far away, it's a huge issue, exactly what you're saying. And this happened after the groundfish resources collapsed. Three things happened: a shift to invertebrates, which was partly fueled by that ecosystem turnover, that the invertebrates did better when the cod wasn't around. A shift to previously unexploited species like hagfish, like sea cucumbers, and a shift up north, very rapidly, very aggressively, which is ongoing. And where there's, you're right, where there's not the management framework in place. A lot of these are deemed exploratory or experimental fisheries, but they have been for 10 or 15 years. I'm particularly studying the halibut fishery up in Greenland halibut up in the Arctic, which has enormous numbers of Greenland shark bycatch, which is completely unregulated. It's the only shark in the Arctic. It's probably of a very slow growth because in all of recorded history, one pregnant female has been observed. And it's just being mined out. Same happens in Greenland and in other places. On the other hand, there is fisheries in the Arctic that are doing well because the Arctic is warming. The enormous growth of the cod stock in the Barents Sea, which is now observed north of 84 degrees north, is an example that benefited Norway because of the expansion of habitat. So it's a mixed bag, but I think I absolutely agree with you that these are issues may not be in the U.S., but certainly in other countries, I'm sure in Russia as well.
Some of this has to do with our basic legal and policy structures. So one of the things that Rick was referring to is, and the reason that the North Pacific Council's decision not to allow a fishery north, I guess, of the Bering Strait, is this burden of proof question. Historically, we've said you can do it until somebody proves it's bad. The burden of proof on the government to show it's bad. They apparently are taking a different approach and saying, no, the burden of proof is on you before you do it to show it's okay. That I'm sorry Jim left, our lawyer, because if there are any of the lawyers in the room that talk about the question of this burden of proof, because that's a basic presumption of the legal system generally. And I think we're going to need a shift in that before we're this in large scale. The other is a jurisdictional question, especially in the area in the high seas. We now have a system on the high seas for minerals of the ocean floor that's a common heritage principle. So, and this is agreed to even by the United States, no offense, United States, that anybody who wants to mine the deep seabed beyond national jurisdiction has to apply to something called the International Seabed Authority for an international lease. I think we should have an international fishing authority for the area beyond national jurisdictions. Daniel Pauly looks at me like I'm crazy when I say this. I don't know why Daniel does that. Because that would be saying you, in these areas beyond national jurisdiction, you can't just go out and do anything. You have to show that you could build in the burden of proof question with a system like that as well, which is essentially what's in the International Seabed Authority. So I think before we can address the problem you're referring to, we need some basic shifts in our legal philosophy about these things.
Thanks. First, I wanted to offer a comment. I don't know if I'm allowed to do that, but I'll test my luck here. I thought it was interesting that we reframed the recreational fisheries question as an allocation question, which I think is representative of sort of a larger phenomenon where we make this into an allocation question without really addressing the other question of what do we want to achieve from recreational fisheries. I just thought that was interesting. The question I wanted to ask is actually about rebuilding timelines. So the current rebuilding timelines we have in place now are a product of many factors, including the need to balance what we want to accomplish from recreational and commercial fisheries and from the ecosystem as a whole, a number of things. How might our perspective on rebuilding timelines be different if we were rebuilding fisheries for a sole purpose, not balancing between multiple interests?
Question really was adding to that, and he asked specifically, do all of these emerging environmental problems, rapidly emerging environmental problems like increasing ocean temperatures, ocean acidification, he didn't mention it, but growing number of hotspots, does that increase the urgency that we experience when we think about fisheries management? Carl Safina.
Let me just talk about rebuilding.
They're both about the temporal aspect of rebuilding, right?
Yeah.
And how do we know 10 years? Is that the right time? Or if we included these factors that Katie was talking about, would it be a different time? And then Carl's question is, if you throw in all of these rapidly changing environmental factors, how would that change these rebuilding times?
Well, let me just talk about right now we've got this 10-year rebuilding time, and make no mistake, in many parts of the country, that is the most important element of the Magnuson-Stevens Act that's driving the on-the-ground TACs, because if you get behind on the rebuilding plan, then the quotas, even though the stock may be increasing in abundance, if you're getting farther behind your probability of achieving your 10-year target, the quotas actually go down. There's no question that if your objective is long-term sustainable yield, you wouldn't worry about the rebuilding time. You would simply worry about getting your fishing mortality rate down so the stock would rebuild. And again, I think it all reflects the fact that we have very, very vague stated objectives. And I think the assumption was that you shouldn't overfish anything and that you should rebuild as quickly as possible, and somehow that would lead to maximum social benefits. Well, I don't know. It all depends on what social benefits we're trying to maximize. But it's certainly leading to enormous economic loss in some places, and I just don't think that that's been accounted for in our system.
I'll just take one part of Katie's question, which is when you asked why is resource allocation the question that people are asking when it comes to recreational fishing, the answer is because that is what the industry is asking for. So that's, that's just a straight political analysis of that is what is driving the discussion. Now, again, you could argue other things, or you could say, well, should we look at what's the economic benefit to that community? Should that be what you want to use as your driving force for, how you define the purpose of the recreational fishing industry? But at this point, it's simply a question of allocation, because that's what the regulated industry is most emphatic about.
And somewhat in response to Ray, the degree to which they've had the rebuilding plans be a source of restriction in fishing opportunity really needs to be looked at in the context of just plain the prevention of overfishing, because in many of those cases there was a high degree of overfishing still going on, and just the cessation of overfishing was enough to cause short-term economic impacts. And the fishing mortality rates implemented as part of the rebuilding plans weren't that much further below these target fishing mortality rates, even if they had a healthy fish stock. It was more the restriction on the overfishing that was causing the immediate reductions. And the further reductions to implement the rebuilding plans, they also, as they complete those rebuilding plans as stocks are rebuilding, hopefully what we would see would be that the plans would result in gradual transitions into a sustainable harvest policy that would have some degree of a target being established that was somewhat below the limit in order to maintain the stock at that state. But the short-term impacts, I think, were largely due to the cessation of the overfishing. There are other examples, though. Certainly the degree to which the West Coast groundfish needed to implement their rebuilding plans that required some severe cutbacks. Those harvest rates were cut well below what the stock should be able to sustain once they are rebuilt. So that was a case where they needed to put in place some very stringent policies.
Just about wrapping up, too.
Yeah. You know, in a way, the 10-year rebuilding requirement is extremely unfortunate because it's not really the best way to manage all fisheries, and Ray pointed out some of the reasons for that. There are some fisheries where, by any net present value distribution of benefits, you wouldn't want to do it in 10 years. You'd want to do it in 20 years or even longer. The reason it's there is the same reason that the optimum yield provision was changed to say you can't have optimum yield above MSY, it can only go below, and that was lobbying by conservation groups who were unhappy at the history of management. They don't think we've come far enough, fast enough. And so they put in these artificial constraints on the system, which in a way are not, in my view, the most reasonable and flexible way to actually manage fisheries if people trust the system. Problem is, people with political power have not trusted the system.
Well, and from everything you've been saying, since these are political decisions, and that's the root problem, as you said, the non-rocket science problem of fisheries is political interference. The only way to deal with it, in my view, is to have stringent rules, which sometimes may be inflexible or unfortunate, but without those stringent rules, we would be where the rest of the world is.
So we've just about run out of time. We will at some point reauthorize the Magnuson Act, right? And so a lot of the things that we've been talking about may come up. And so if you had one sentence that you wanted to put out there in front of Congress in 140 characters or less, what would it be? And because Ray's holding his head, we'll start with Boris.
Stay the course, walk the talk, and not only do it domestically.
Be persistent and keep training young people, like most of the people in this room, who are actually going to fix this problem for us.
That was short. I think that reauthorization, better recognition of the fact that these are trade-off analyses and that we really need to look beyond just the biological limits and bring more things into consideration up front that we make the decisions is an important factor.
Full disclosure.
Generate value broadly defined from our resources.
Ray?
I would say it's eliminate politics from decision making.
You weren't listening to me. Eliminate
politics from the tactical decisions. The politics should decide the objectives. The tactics you should not have political interference from elected people once you've decided what your objectives are.
Okay,
I'll agree with that further specification.
We'll leave it there. I want to thank the panel, especially Rich, who's come from so far, and Boris, who's come from a different country. But thank you, panel. Big hand to panel. And to all the people who are watching the stream, Mary turnip seeds out there. Didn't get to your question, Mary. We will save this, and it will be on the Nicholas Institute YouTube channel. So either check back at the Nicholas Institute or find your way back through the network that got you the link that you've been watching today in the first place. And we'll make sure that disseminates back out to you. And thank you for you guys in Beaufort and everybody here coming out to this.